Just quickly before I get into today's video, I will do my best to use as many photos as possible, but if I can't find enough good quality ones, I will reuse some. I apologize for that, and I apologize if I butcher any names. I did listen to how they were said on Google, but of course, that could be wrong, and I could be mispronouncing them, and again, I apologize if I do. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. The Royal Canadian Navy has been around since May 4th, 1910, and in that history, it's had a whopping 5 cruisers. For context, there is 6 Manitoban riverboats preserved at the Marine Museum of Manitoba in Selkirk, which means we have more preserved Manitoban riverboats than the Canadian Navy, which had a 65-year head start in the museum, has had cruisers. The more you know. So, in today's video, let's go over all 5 of them from my least favorite to my favorite, and include a personal ranking out of 10 based on how much I like them. This is just my opinion, and everyone can have their own. All 5 are the sole members of our class to serve in Canadian service, and we somehow had more travel class destroyers with 8 versus only 5 cruisers. 4 of the 5 served with another navy before joining the Royal Canadian Navy, which is interesting, and the last was laid down by another navy, but was completed by the Canadian Navy. So let's get into the video. So coming in at number 5, the first Canadian cruiser, and the only second-class protector cruiser to serve in Canadian service, and the only Polo-class cruiser, and the very first ship in the Royal Canadian Navy, hmcs Rainbow. Rainbow was first commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Rainbow in 1892, until decommissioning in 1909, and was then sold with another cruiser that's in at number 4 to Canada. Rainbow was the first of the 2 commissioned, though. She was commissioned on August 4th, 1910, and she continued to serve until being decommissioned on June 1st, 1920, and sold to a scrapper in Seattle, Washington the same year of 1920. Rainbow's wheel is preserved at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario. Besides being the first Canadian cruiser and the first Royal Canadian ship, there really isn't much to like about her. I don't like the look of the Apollo-class cruisers. I do like her for the fact that she's the very first Canadian warship, but that's nowhere near enough to save the lack of interest I have in her. She served Canada longer than the next ship in line, but she just isn't interesting to me. I completely get why people would like her, but I just don't. Maybe that'll change if and when I do a history video on her. It has happened to other ships in the past. But for now, I lack interest in her. I'll give her a generous ranking, being the first Royal Canadian Navy ship, of a 3 out of 10, the lowest ranking I've ever given a ship so far. And coming in at number 4, the only first-class protector cruiser and the only Diadem-class cruiser, I probably butchered that a little bit, but hopefully I got it, to serve in the Royal Canadian Navy. HMCS Niobe was first commissioned by the Royal Navy as HMS Niobe on December 6, 1898, until her transfer to the new Royal Canadian Navy along with Rainbow. Niobe was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy as HMCS Niobe on September 6, 1910. Just over a month after Rainbow was commissioned. However, she became a store ship in Halifax after being decommissioned on September 6, 1915, after being deemed worn out. Her superstructure was badly damaged during the Halifax explosion, and she was sold for scrap in 1920 and caught up in Philadelphia in 1922. Her bell resides at the Naval Museum of Halifax in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was better looking than Rainbow, which is why she's above her. There's really nothing notable besides the fact that she's the only first-class protector cruiser in Canadian service, and being one of the first Royal Canadian Navy ships, and of course being part of the Halifax explosion. On my scale, she's a 4 out of 10 above Rainbow because of her looks. However, she's a little below number 3. Speaking of number 3, coming in at number 3, the first Canadian light cruiser and the only Arethusa-class light cruiser to serve in Canadian service. She also was the shortest-serving Canadian cruiser. She was first commissioned by the Royal Navy in September 1914 as HMS Aurora, until her decommissioning in late 1918. She was then sold to Canada and commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on November 1st, 1920. where she underwent some pretty expensive work. After drastic budget cuts, she was decommissioned on July 1st, 1922. She didn't even last 2 years in service, and was stripped for parts and left in Halifax until city officials demanded her to leave after her deterioration worsened in 1927. In August 1927, she was sold for scrap to a firm in Sorel, Quebec. She would be the last Canadian cruiser for the next 22 years until 1944. Overall, I like her more than Rainbow and Niobe, but only because she looks more modern and was a light cruiser, which I absolutely love. And I do not like protected cruisers like Niobe and Rainbow. Nothing against protected cruisers, I'm just not a huge fan of them. There's really nothing special about her besides being the first Canadian light cruiser, and the first Canadian cruiser built in the 1900s and not the 1890s like the first two. I'd love to say more about her, but there really isn't much to say. If this list was history-based, she'd be lost by far given how short she served in Canadian service. I'll give her a ranking on my personal scale of a 5 out of 10, above Niobe and Rainbow, but well below numbers 1 and 2. Speaking of number 2, coming in at number 2... the only Fiji-class light cruiser to see Canadian service, HMCS Uganda, later HMCS Quebec, was the second last cruiser in the Royal Canadian Navy and the second last to be decommissioned. She originally served from her first commissioning on January 3, 1943, for the Royal Navy like the previous three cruisers, until her transfer to Canada and being commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on October 21, 1944, making her the first Canadian cruiser since Aurora was decommissioned in 1922, 22 years before. She kept the name like all the others, but of course used HMCS instead of HMS. She was decommissioned on August 1st, 1947, and then sat, until being recommissioned on January 14th, 1952, after the outbreak of the Korean War, and renamed HMCS Quebec. However, she would never fight in Korea. She actually was sent to the East Coast from the West Coast to replace ships that were sent to Korea. So she never, ever was even in the Pacific when the war was happening. She was only in the Atlantic after being recommissioned. She was decommissioned for the final time on June 15, 1956, and arrived in Osaka, Japan for scrapping on February 6, 1961, a year after HMCS Ontario, which was decommissioned 2 years after Quebec, but was sold for scrap before Quebec. Although that's a story for another day. She's my second favorite Canadian cruiser for a few reasons. Firstly, she was the second best looking Canadian cruiser after the ship at number 1, and I absolutely love light cruisers with triple turrets. Secondly, she feels like a Canadian warship, unlike the previous three cruisers, who to me really just felt like out-of-place British ships. I mean, yes, they were originally British serving, just like Uganda, but Uganda was in Canadian service longer, and frankly, she barely served in the Royal Navy. After all, she was about a year and a half in the Royal Navy. She isn't really that well known, but she's still not forgotten by those of us who know of her, especially me. I gave HMCS Quebec a rating on my personal scale of a 9 out of 10. She's my top 10 favorite Canadian naval ships of all time, right on the heels of number 1 on this list. Speaking of number 1, coming in as my favorite Canadian cruiser of all time and my favorite cruiser of all time. So coming in at number 1. The only Minotaur-class light cruiser to serve in Canada was Minotaur herself. She was also the last light cruiser and the last cruiser in the Canadian Navy. Sure, she was launched in the UK, but she was transferred to the Royal Canadian Navy by the Royal Navy before being commissioned, making her the only Canadian cruiser not to serve in the Royal Navy first. She was commissioned on May 25th, 1945 as HMCS Ontario, and served until being decommissioned on October 15th, 1958, never actually having worn her original name Minotaur in service. She was then sent for scrap in Osaka, Japan, like HMCS Quebec, as they were sold together. However, Ontario arrived on November 16, 1960, after originally being sold for scrap to a yard in Vancouver, but since they didn't finish the job, the Navy took her back and then resold her, along with Quebec, to Osaka, but I couldn't find any information as if Quebec was sold to them too. I haven't found any information yet. All I know is they were sold together to Osaka. Fortunately for us, we still have both of Ontario's belts. One at HMCS Ontario Cadet Training Centre in Kingston, Ontario, and the second is at the Maritime Museum of British Columbia in Victoria, BC. For those who aren't Canadian, that's British Columbia, one of the provinces. She was also the last cruiser in Canadian service, having been decommissioned 2 years after Quebec. Fun fact, it's not Quebec, it's Quebec. I somehow only learned about that 5 years ago. It's surprisingly not well known. She'd be the last Canadian cruiser, as we haven't had one since, and we most likely never will again. Not least with the current way the Navy operates. I mean, even look with the American Navy, they don't have very many cruisers either, and they're the most powerful Navy in the world. To me, Ontario is the most Canadian cruiser of all 5, as she, while launched in the UK, was the only one to serve only in Canada, unlike the other 4 which saw Royal Navy service first, even though it wasn't very long in the case of HMCS Quebec. I also love the Minotaur class, along with Minotaur herself, since, well, she's Ontario, being the only member of the class, she's special to me. She's one of my favorite Canadian Navy ships of all time, with Quebec right behind her. I love light cruisers and their triple turrets. I just like triple turrets. For example, I love heavy cruisers with triple turrets, especially the Des Moines class. But that is a story for another day. She was also built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, like all 3 Canadian aircraft carriers, which I made a video on last week. She was also by far the most used Canadian cruiser, and fans of the Royal Canadian Navy love her, despite her being scrapped 65 years ago. I rank Ontario as a 10 out of 10, and she's my favorite cruiser of all time, not just among the 5 Canadian cruisers, but of all the cruisers to ever exist. Sure, we had a small fleet, but they got the job done. After all, the Canadian Navy much preferred its destroyers, but that's a list for another day.